It was about year 180 when a Christian bishop, about whom we actually know very little, wrote to a pagan about whom we know even less, saying that God brought everything into being out of what does not exist, so that this greatness might be known, his greatness might be known as understood through his works. Now, these words may seem to contemporary eyes and ears thoroughly unexceptional as a piece of Christian teaching. All Christians agree with this today. But at the time, they represented something new and controversial for at least the entire tradition of Greek philosophy, which provided a terminological background for the foundations of Christian theology. Why is it so? Well, those who spoke about the origin of the world back then, and these are pagan creation stories that I refer here to, they described the world's origin in terms of reordering and already existing stuff, or they referred to this thing happening through some kind of process of birth or manipulation or emanation or conflict, or maybe just a chance rearrangement, again, of an already existing stuff. The Greeks in particular held firmly to the idea of an eternal cosmos, permanent and immutable, both in its essential structure and in its make-up. So Greek, we have the notion of an actually everlasting cosmos and circular time, which means that there was a movement that can be or could be observed in the cosmos. It is continuous circular process of birth and corruption, but the cosmos taken as such, as a whole, is existing forever and in a way is something immutable. And then we have the Greek metaphysical principle, which said or says that nothing comes from nothing. So for those who believed in this, one of the crucial metaphysical principles, the claim that universe came into existence from nothing, that was something unusual, strange, and controversial. But this article of faith was actually was new not only for Greek philosophers, it was actually new also for the Christians. Because the Christian theology in first generations, before the year 180, this theology, yes, it emphasized that creation is not an outcome of a violent combat among gods, that it is not a manufacture by gods from the corpse of some primeval monster or a god. Yes, it is not an outcome of the development of the primordial cosmic egg, as in some pagan traditions, but at the same time, trying to say what creation actually is or how creation can or should be understood. First Christians, they described creation in terms of Plato's description, again, of gods ordering the pre-existing yet unformed matter. And they did that in reference to they did that, as I said, in reference to Plato, but also some of them referred to the Neoplatonist idea of the emanation of everything from the divine. And that was the basic teaching. So there was no notion of creatio ex nihilo. And this refers to first Christians, but it also refers, as we believe nowadays, to the Jewish tradition. It was only in the Middle Ages when this truth of faith that everything was created ex nihilo, when this truth of faith was accepted in Jewish theology. To give you just one example, Justin the Martyr, he comments on Plato's description of creation as God's action of shaping the universe of pre-existing matter, and he says that it remains in agreement with what we find in Genesis, and he actually claims that Plato must have read Genesis because he's so in line with what Genesis says about creation. So, when we speak about creatio ex nihilo, what we mean by that, obviously, is that nothingness is a lack of any real being. So, nothingness as such cannot be like any sort of subject of divine action. Aquinas would say that in creation, the recipient of divine action is not the nothingness, but that which is created. And yet we emphasize that universe came into existence from nothing. So if the church decided to teach this particular concept and this particular further description of the way in which the world came into existence, we should ask a question: how did the church come to the conclusion that, again, universe is created from nothing? And do we find this idea in the Bible? We ask first as Christians. Well, in the Bible we have the verb bara, which, yes, it is never referred directly to any substrate, and its subject is always God, yet its etymology refers to action performed on the pre-existing matter. It means to cut, to tear, to make, to put together. And so at the same time, we have to remember that the Bible doesn't say explicitly that God did not create from a pre-existing matter. So we may say that we don't find at least a direct confirmation of the claim that the universe came into existence from nothing in the book of Genesis. Having said this, we have to remember that, yes, there are actually those who would like to find or name or specify at least indirect arguments in favor of creatio ex nihilo in the book of Genesis. They say, yes, the Bible never says explicitly that God created everything ex nihilo, but it also does not say explicitly at the beginning that there was some particular matter out of which God created. Others say that the Jewish tradition does not know the idea of being, of entity that would be independent from God, out of which he then could create. And then the third argument says that the primordial abyss and darkness described in the book of Genesis, they actually refer to the reality which was previously created ex nihilo. So this is in a way taken for granted. Well, whether these arguments are convincing or not is a good question. Today, the majority of contemporary exegetes, they agree with the medieval Jewish scripture scholar and commentator, whose name was Sholmo Itzhaki, or Rashi, and he claims that the first verse of Genesis is actually better rendered as a dependent clause of sentence that includes all first three verses of the book of Genesis. And according to this approach, the more accurate and the proper translation would be this: when God began to create heaven and earth, the world being then a formless waste with darkness over the deep and only an awesome wind sweeping over the face of the waters, God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. So if you read those three verses of the first verses of Genesis in this way, it becomes clear that at least to this passage, God seems to be working on some already existing stuff. There is a watery deep and enveloping a formless world. This reality is not personified, yet it is hard to avoid an impression that it is in some sense resistant maybe to God's will. So we may refer here to this term tohu vabohu, the abyss of water, which refers etymologically to the name of the goddess in the Babylonian poem Enuma Elish. Her name was Tiamat. And out of her body, heaven and earth are formed according to this mythological story. So we therefore conclude that we do not at least find the confirmation of creatio ex nihilo in the book of Genesis. Now, another point of reference, actually for years, if not for centuries, was the second book of Maccabees, where we have this beautiful yet terrifying story of martyrdom of 7 sons. And when the youngest of them is about to be killed, his mother is given a chance to convince him to change his mind and reject in a way the God of Israel to save his life. And she leans towards him and she says these words. What is important in this passage for us is the underlying part of it. God did not make them, which means heaven and earth, sea, and all that is in them out of existing things, she says. In the same way, humankind came into existence. So many interpreted those very words out that God did not make them out of existing things as a confirmation of creatio ex nihilo. Now, today we know that it is a very problematic interpretation. The Greek original says hoti uk ex onton epoiesen auta hot heos. Interestingly, the Vulgate translates it ex nihilo fecit illa Deus, and then all other translations in modern languages followed the Vulgate and translated it saying that ex nihilo, out of nothing, God created all those or made all those things. But the new version of Vulgate, published in 1979, actually goes to the proper translation or offers a proper translation which is more correct and says non ex his quae erant, God made those things that we see around us. So how shall we understand this term, not out of existing things? Well, it doesn't mean that God made things ex nihilo. It means that God made something from something else which was not yet this thing that it became. So let's say I came into existence from egg and sperm coming from my parents, right? So I came into existence from something that was not yet me but it was already something. It was some sort of matter. So exegetes, they claim this is how we should translate and understand this passage. Coming into being of anything new without any implication of whether or not this new thing is derived from any pre-existing substance. There are other arguments concerning this passage. Some would say it would be really strange to think that of a sudden, in this particular occasion, this mother of those 7 sons, she introduces rather new theological truth, right? Is it the best moment to teach like one of the deepest and most controversial theological truths when her son is about to be killed? Others say, well, we may reinterpret it in a different way and say, well, she is probably sharing with her son something that everybody believed in, and she's just reminding him about this. But then we may push back and say, well, how come that everybody believes and understands it when it is not actually mentioned in this way before? It is also important to see that she concludes this passage concludes with her statement that in the same way humankind came into existence, and humankind, even in the book of Genesis, does not come straight from nothing into existence. It comes from already existing matter. And also exegetes, they emphasize this preposition ek, underlined preposition on the slide. They say once this preposition is being used, this opens the way to think, at least at the level of linguistic analysis, about God actually producing something out of pre-existing matter. And the last argument, Gerhard May, one of the important scripture scholars, he claims that the idea of creatio ex nihilo does not appear in the Judaic tradition of the pre-Hellenic and also Hellenic periods. And this is a Hellenic period. That would be strange in this period to introduce this idea without further explanation, because as I said in the beginning, Greeks believed that the universe existed forever. Do we find, therefore, confirmation for creatio ex nihilo? Maybe in New Testament, if not in the Old Testament. Well, not really. St. Paul, at one point, he says about God who gives life to the dead and calls into existence the things that do not exist. And the letter to Hebrews speaks about or shares or teaches as a matter of faith that the worlds were prepared by the word of God, so that what is seen was made from things that are not visible. But again, those texts cannot be treated as a proof for a biblical doctrine of creatio ex nihilo. These texts speak about creation only in passing as part of an appeal to divine power and trustworthiness. And the first passage, again, may and should probably be understood in the same way, which is bringing into existence something from something else, which is not yet a thing that it becomes. Whereas the second passage can be interpreted in various ways, because something that is invisible is not necessarily something that is not existent, right? We believe that there are things that are invisible and yet still existent and real. So we then therefore conclude that we do not find a direct or at least direct confirmation of creatio ex nihilo in the scripture. Maybe some indirect ways, but not a direct confirmation. And therefore, how did we come to this conclusion again, that the world was created ex nihilo? Usually, and this is not going to be original, usually or many important Christian dogmas, they were formulated within the context of some heresy or some teaching that was considered to be unacceptable. And the situation here is again similar. What is the background of the origin of the doctrine of creatio ex nihilo? It is Gnostic Christianity. And specifically, we think here about the idea or the concept of, we may say, hypostasized evil, an evil that is not just lack of good, as the later tradition will define it, but evil as something substantial, as a substantial competitor of what is good. That led to the idea of evil being an outcome of the action of an evil God. And that evil God sometimes was thought as equal with the good God of the Bible, sometimes in the mitigated version of dualism, because this is a dualist understanding of divinity. The mitigated version of this dualism would speak about some sort of lower God who is responsible for evil and good God who is responsible for good. Yet another version of dualism would speak about not God bringing evil into existence, but maybe those transmitting causes, that is, in this case, angels who are responsible for evil because they did not succeed in creating only good things or bringing only good things into existence as instrumental works, causes in the hands of God. So this is Gnostic thinking that obviously when saying those things, those Gnostics, they question the goodness of matter itself. If it comes from the material world, if it comes from an evil God, or at least parts of this material world, then matter cannot be good in itself. And that provokes a reaction, well, surprisingly enough, first reaction from Gnostics themselves, because among Gnostics, we actually find a theologian who was the first one who argued in favor of creatio ex nihilo. And his name was Basilides. He died in year 140. And he is the first one who exists that the whole universe derives directly and exclusively from God. He says this, or insists that originally there was nothing, not matter, neither being nor non-being, neither simple nor composite, neither intelligible nor sensible, neither human nor angel nor God. well, you may ask, oh, well, maybe he's going too far. No, he's not. He's trying to say by this that there was no something out of which things were created. So not even the body of God, because the world is not God. The world is something different from God. So there was nothing out of which stuff that surrounds us was created. He claims, therefore, that God created ex nihilo, the primordial seed. He speaks about this, he calls it a seedbed of the cosmos. Here is another quotation which came to us through a commentary on it written by Hippolytus. In this way, says Basilides, the God who is non-existent made the cosmos that is non-existent from those things that are non-existent, having founded and established one particular seed, having in itself the entire universal seedbed of the cosmos. So he remains a Gnostic. So even though he argues in favor of creatio ex nihilo, we believe for the first time, he remains a Gnostic. Why is that? Well, he remains a Gnostic because he emphasizes that the entire universe, yes, is created ex nihilo, but note that God creates actually this first primordial seed, which for him is something in between an already actual matter that we can empirically verify and see and touch, and this nothingness. So this seed is in between, and then God does not lower himself to intervene in this already created, seed of the universe to actualize it. This seed actualizes by itself, and maybe this is the sort of a source of evil present in the world, because God is not engaged, because as Gnostic, he does not like the idea that God actually has something to do with any sort of matter. It may even be the something in between real matter and nothingness. So some claim that this still Gnostic thinking may be considered as a primitive version of deism. And yet, it is the first claim that creation was actually ex nihilo. And then we have another Gnostic who comes from Cartagena, Hermogenes. We do not know much about him. There's no writings that he left. We know about him through Tertullian. And so he reflects, after what he learns from Basilides, he reflects again on creation, and he says, well, we have three options. God creates universe out of his own being, God creates universe from nothingness, and God creates the universe from something else. Hermogenes says, we have to dismiss the first option because that would suggest that God is divisible and he's not. Then he says we have to actually reject the second option as well, because if the universe is created ex nihilo, it is entirely dependent on God's will for its existence, and this would mean that it necessarily is good, entirely good, and we encounter imperfection and evil in creation. So therefore, the second option is not acceptable. Therefore, he goes back to the claim that God had to create universe from an already existing matter. I mention this Gnostic interpretation and proposition because it is precisely to Hermogenes that Theophilus of Antioch that I mentioned in the beginning responds. And he responds to him saying again, as I said, that God creates out of what does not exist. You may say, well, this is the same language that we found in the Bible, so maybe your entire argument is wrong and creatio ex nihilo is in the Bible. Well, he may be using similar terms, but he has actually a deeply developed or much more developed theology where he actually backs this claim with a reflection that clearly now speaks about creatio ex nihilo. He says this: Plato and those of his school confess that God is uncreated Father and maker of all things, but then they argue that God and Mother are both uncreated, and they say that Mother is co-eternal with God. This is how first Christians understood Mother. But if God is uncreated and Mother is uncreated, then God is, according to the Platonists, not the maker of all things, nor, so far as they teach, is God monarchy maintained. Furthermore, in the same way that God, because uncreated, is also unchangeable, also if Matter were uncreated, it too would be unchangeable and equal to God. For that which is created is variable and changeable, but that which is uncreated is unwavering and unchangeable. So that tells us that he now really has a strong argument that he offers us in favor of the claim that Matter must be created. It cannot be uncreated, it cannot be everlasting with God as a substrate out of which he creates. More than this, what is crucial in this entire development of this dogma is that Theophilus of Antioch he not only produces, we may say, a metaphysical and philosophical argument that I just referred to, he also tries to name theological motivations and also theological fallacy of Hermogenes' position. And he does so saying this: Hermogenes wants to see theology of creation as an integral part of theodicy, because he thinks that the only way to avoid making God responsible for evil is to assume he created again from an already existing stuff. So he links those creation to theodicy. And Theophilus would say this is his mistake, because theology of creation should not be regarded as theodicy. This is a part of Christian dogma in itself. And evil, if it is in created universe, it is not a natural consequence of creation and which would make God responsible for it, but it's deeply irrational perversion. If we would like to make a connection to some other part of Christian dogma, here, says Theophilus, rather theology of creation opens the way to soteriology, to the truth about salvation. Why? Creatio ex nihilo is a necessary implication for the Christian confidence in God's ability to save the fallen humanity and the entire universe. In other words, the same power that is required to create ex nihilo, an absolute omnipotence that is required for this to happen on the side of the cause of this occurrence of this phenomenon, the same power is needed to bring this created reality back to its original state, or after the fall, right? So that would be a theological argument brought by Theophilus of Antioch. The further tradition built on this, what was offered by Theophilus, and I will just mention the most important names here. We find Irenaeus of Lyon, who claims this. He speaks about creatio ex nihilo in order to defend God's omnipotence. And he says, all the scriptures, both prophetical and evangelical, clearly and unambiguously proclaim that the one and only God, to the exclusion of any other, has made all things through his word, things visible and invisible, heavenly and earthly. And then he continues and says, to attribute the matter of created beings to the power and will of the God of all things is something believable, acceptable, and consistent. Man cannot make something out of nothing, but only from matter which has prior existence. God surpasses man in that he himself provides the matter of his work for his work, matter which previously did not exist. And then we have Tertullian, who supports this teaching once again, and he now firmly teaches that the object of our worship is the one God who out of nothing, simply for the glory of his majesty, fashioned this enormous universe, which it's with its supply of elements, bodies, and spirits. So we can see how this tradition actually departs from fighting Gnosticism, and it develops to emphasize divine omnipotence, and here also to emphasize also the purpose of God's creation, which is simply the glory of his majesty. And we cannot skip Augustine, who has a beautiful and very poetic passage in his Confessions in book number 12, where he says this about God: "For you didst create the heaven and the earth not out of yourself, for then they would be equal to your only Son and thereby to you. And there is no sense in which it would be right that anything should be equal to you that was not of you. But what else besides you was there out of which you mightest create these things, O God, one Trinity and triune unity? And therefore it was out of nothing at all that you didst create the heaven and earth, something great and something small. For you are almighty and good, and able to make all things good, even the great heaven and the small earth. You wast, and there was nothing else from which you didst create heaven and earth. Those two things, one near you, the other near to nothing. The one to which only you are superior, and the other to which nothing else is inferior." Beautiful passage confirming the same truth. And then we have Thomas Aquinas, first Anselm of Canterbury. Anselm of Canterbury, actually, this is the scholastic period already, and then he, as a good scholastic, provides a distinction. He again asks, what are the ways in which we may think about this very term ex nihilo? He says there are three possible interpretations of this term. First, not being made in any way, to be simply uncreated, and that applies only to God. Then we may think about the most fitting form of being, well, some sort of primordial matter. And then the third way of thinking about the term ex nihilo is in reference to, or we may define it as the lack of any pre-existing matter in the case of the emergence of a new entity. And he says that in this sense, ex nihilo relates or refers to creation. So he tries to clarify even more this term in terms within philosophy and theology. Thomas Aquinas is after the official formulation of this dogma, and first the official formulation of the dogma come this late. So imagine. So once again, first time it was mentioned in year 180, and it comes to be officially formulated not earlier than in 1215, where the Fourth Lateran Council, as you can see on the slide, says about God, who is the creator of all things, and it adds that by his almighty power from the beginning of time, he made at once out of nothing both order of creatures, the spiritual and corporeal, and human beings who are both. So therefore, by the time Thomas Aquinas produces his theology, this is an already accepted and confirmed truth of faith. So he simply refers to it at several occasions. This is just one example where Aquinas says that nothing can be unless it is from God, who is the universal cause of all being. Hence, it is necessary to say that God brings things into being from nothing. And the truth is that Aquinas, he doesn't spend much time on it, on trying to develop a support for this truth of faith and thinking about how it came to be. He simply takes it for granted in a way. What would be, therefore, the theological qualification of this important theological truth? Well, this truth that was formulated once again by Lateran Council, the Fourth Lateran Council, was confirmed and repeated by the Council of Florence in 1441 and in the Constitution Theophilus of the First Vatican Council. And at the same time, so we may say that it is a dogma of faith solemnly defined by the Church, and yet at the same time, this is interesting that the First Vatican Council, although it speaks about natural power of human reason to discover and get to know God as the Creator, it did not and does not dogmatize this assertion that the world comes nihilo. So, First Vatican Council says that by the power of human reason, we may come to the conclusion that the world was created and has the first cause, and that made it to be what it is. And this is dogmatized by this First Vatican Council. But this, once again, qualification or assertion that the creation came into being ex nihilo is not dogmatized in this way, which means for this we need revelation. But it's interesting that this revelation is not straightforwardly found in the Bible, as I showed, but it comes from a later reflection, theological reflection of the Church. So it is, in my opinion, a very interesting dogma or part of dogma. The very claim that we can come to the conclusion that the world is created and has its first cause is in itself a very interesting part of Christian dogma, where the claim is that we can, again, come to knowledge of this only through the power of our human intellect, our reason, whereas all other major truths of faith, for them, we need revelation. And again, within this truth of faith, this qualification that this first cause brings things into existence ex nihilo, this is not dogmatized here by the First Vatican Council, but it requires reference to revelation and its interpretation in the theology of the Church. Now, I will conclude with a few, I believe, interesting remarks. Let's go to the creeds. I think that most of us, we don't realize that there is a substantial difference in terms of creation theology between Western and Eastern creeds in the First Church, where the Western creeds, they do not mention the Father as the author of creation. Some claim that the fact that those creeds, they speak about the Father, that in itself implies a creative role, because this is what Father does. He brings into existence his children. But others say, well, they should have been probably more explicit. The Eastern creeds, almost without exception, state the belief in one God, the Father Almighty, whom they do depict as creator of all things visible and invisible, or some similar wording. In the West, we have the Apostolic Creed from the 3rd century, where we actually do find the claim that, or this proposition that we believe in God the Father, who is the creator of heaven and earth. The historians of theology, they believe that it was the North African creeds that were the first one in the West that actually did refer to creator of all things, universorum creatorum. And the last thing is the terminology. when we speak about creation in those creeds? Well, in Old Testament, I mentioned this Hebrew verb bara. So it is interesting that, I mean, I'm not an expert here. This is something that I found in the sources I've read in preparation. In the Greek version of the Old Testament, the claim is that the best term that is closest to bara would be demurgein, making something, which means obviously making something from pre-existing matter. And yet, the Septuagint uses poiein, which is, has in a way similar meaning, but some claim that there is a reason why they use poiein and not demurgein, which is they would like to emphasize that what God does is somewhat different from what we understand as transforming an already existing stuff. And yet, in the Vulgate, this term is translated as facere. And I think it is really unfortunate that it got to the creeds. So we say today, for example, in English, that we believe in God who is maker of heaven and earth and not creator, right? I come from Poland and we actually have creator in Polish, but it's, again, not faithful. You may charge it of not being faithful to the official Latin version of creed. Now, in the New Testament, it's interesting, again, instead of using poiein, which is used in Septuagint, the New Testament uses rather another verb, ktizein. Again, you would find those who claim maybe now New Testament wants to emphasize, well, at least indirectly, that bringing that creation is ex nihilo. And yet, this ktizein again refers to making from an already existing stuff. Also, human beings can be ktisis. But still others push back and they say that this term refers not only to mechanical, physical making of things, but it actually refers even more to a spiritual act of the will. And they claim, well, maybe this could be referred to God as creator ex nihilo, because he's not working on any physical matter, but on nothingness, or this is actually a wrong term. I just said we should not use, we should not speak this way. He doesn't work on nothingness. He simply brings things into existence from nothingness. So there are those who work on those terms, carefully trace them, and try to maybe form an argument about, again, an indirect confirmation of creation of the world ex nihilo in the Bible. Yet, on the base of what I've read, I think I agree with those who claim that we do not find a confirmation of this truth in the Bible. It is a fruit of a later development of Christian theology, which obviously is grounded in the Bible. It's not that it's not related to what we find in the Bible, but yet it is a further development, which shows, again, the beauty of our Catholic faith, which is grounded in the Bible, and yet then develops and believes, I mean, we believe in the divine assistance of the Holy Spirit and sanctifying supernatural grace that helps us to better understand and phrase the most important parts of the Christian dogma. So that's it for tonight. Thank you very much for your patience, and I believe that there is now time for some questions.
Thank you very much, Father Mariusz, for that very insightful and I think clear presentation of the history of the idea of creatio ex nihilo. We do have a couple of questions, and so we'll take a few time for that. And if I maybe start with one that I have myself. So you mentioned that the doctrine was not officially defined until the 1200s, and like other doctrines, it kind of, so for instance, I know, Eucharistic theology, certain aspects of that wasn't defined as such until the 10th century, but it had roots in the fathers. But there was particular controversy that happened in the 10th century, such that the church felt the need to clarify the Eucharistic theology then, because there were controversies and disputes over what exactly the Eucharist is and the idea of transubstantiation. Do you have a sense of, was there a particular controversy going on in the 12th century that required this clarification of what had been in the traditions at the 200s, but was not defined until the 1200s?
Yeah, thank you very much. It's true that, and maybe I should have emphasized it even more, that there is obviously a continuation, and we find roots of this teaching in the fathers of the church. And in the 13th century, there is a controversy. It is a controversy with the new Gnostic ideas coming from those Caters and Valdensians, right? So heretical groups here in Europe, in France, which gave the origin actually to our order, and that is the context. So the similar, ideas that come again and again, the skepticism about the goodness of Mother. And it's actually just one last thing. It's interesting that this longer quotations that I brought is like a package of creation theology, which again, for the first time, actually brings many other aspects of this dogma into one thing. And it's interesting that it happens in this particular time in 13th century. Yeah.
Very good. Thank you very much. So we have another question coming from Luca, and he asks, he has a general question about, is there a difference between the idea of creatio ex nihilo and the idea of God's sort of maintenance of things in creation? And is there, how are those related? And is there a particular, would you say that one has maybe, is one more rooted in Genesis chapter 1 than the other, or are they both there, or are they both later developments, or?
Well, thank you for the question, Luca. Yes, in the classical formulation of creation dogma, we have those two principal aspects of creating on the side. Obviously, this is the action of God, bringing stuff into existence ex nihilo, and then continual sustaining this stuff in existence. Right. Now, obviously, in God, this is one and the same action. Yet, from our perspective, it is valid to speak about, in a way, two aspects of this one action of God, because we live in the reality where we, in a way, we observe the continual existence of things, and we come to this conclusion, as I said, about the fact that they come into existence ex nihilo. Now, so there are two aspects, and again, you may find those who would say we shouldn't even speak about them because this is just one thing. You may find those who say, no, it is valid to speak about those two aspects because we as limited creatures with our access that we have to the reality, we can observe those aspects, and it's important for our understanding of knowledge to discern those aspects. Now, to what extent they are present in the Bible? Basically speaking, what is being said about those first accounts of creation is that, and it's agreed by scripture scholars, is that those who have written this material, they did not have a developed metaphysics as later generations had, and they had a different mindset. And what they did want to express is that everything in the universe depends on God. That was their principle, and one God only. That was the principal message that they had in terms of creation, and that is why they agreed, for example, that the idea of God making things out of something that is out there in Plato is okay. First Christians, when they discussed it, because in a way, for them also that was the most crucial part. And then only in the fire of those theological errors, it was only in this context that a deeper understanding was developed. And so therefore, I would think that going back to Genesis, I think that what it emphasizes is dependence of everything on God. So I would actually think that maybe we should say that the continual existence of things and dependence of those things on God, this is the definition of creation in Genesis, more than bringing stuff. Even though there is this description of bringing stuff, but again, what is crucial for them is the dependence and God guiding the creation. Because one last aspect, we have to remember that those texts are solidified in captivity. In Babylonian captivity, where they go back and they reflect on the Israel being called by God to be one nation chosen by God, and then being protected, guided, and taken care of. And then they expand it on the entire creation, and they say, this is what means to be created, to be under this care and protection from this on the side of God. So the coming into, we are so concentrated on coming into existence of stuff nowadays. I mean, the church also got to this, and rightly so. But at the beginning, I think it was not so.
So we have another question from, I believe it's Mapi Rodriguez, and she was asking, would the theology of creatio ex nihilo be a type of or related to kind of apophatic aspects of theology that try to explain God based off what God is not? Is there a relation there, or do you think these are different ideas?
That's a very interesting question. It is a very interesting question because in many sources and textbooks, I read many textbooks on creation theology, and many authors, they agree that we actually, when we say ex nihilo, we don't actually know what we speak about, because it is actually virtually, difficult, if not impossible, for us to imagine nothingness. Because when we think about nothingness, we think about an empty space without things, but space is space already. So those terms ex nihilo also, as the formulation from Lateran Fourth says, from the beginning of time. What is beginning? Beginning already is a term that refers to time. So those are the situations where linguistically we approach the limit of our language. We say that, for example, everything was created instantaneously, but an instant of time is already, a bit of time, and it was not like that. So some of the authors would maybe agree with you and say that it becomes, in a way, an apophatic strain of theology, because and Aquinas actually says that too, we are better in saying what creation is not rather than saying what creation is, and yet he wants to have this cataphatic side to it as well, and spends a lot of time on it. But maybe it's definitely indispensable to acknowledge that we approach here the limits of our language, and we don't know what to do with this.
I think we have time for one more question. And so there's a question here from Tomasz, which actually I think kind of fits into the last two questions. And he says, so it's a question and kind of a clarification. So can creatio ex nihilo be understood in terms of the classical notion of change? And he then further kind of connecting what you're saying is, if time starts with the creation of the universe, it seems that there is nothing prior to creation, including the potentiality of creation.
Yeah.
So how does this relate to the Greek notions?
Thank you, and for this question and for all other questions as well. So Aquinas emphasizes that very strongly, that creation is not a change, and as you say, if there's no time, if there's no space, it's not a change. So yet, what is creation? So it is an act which is unlike any other acts, right? So in a way, we have to refer here to, apophatic theology again, and say we basically know and do not know what this is, right? I had one more idea, but it escaped my mind. I wanted to say something more, but I guess.
It went back into nothing, I guess. So,
Well.
sorry, that was bad. On that horrible pun, we would take one moment to thank Father Mariusz Tabaczek for his wonderful talk and for taking our questions. And we'd also like to say thank you to all of you online for joining us this evening. This is the second to last talk in our Angelicum Professors online series. And please join us for our finale on Monday, June 6th for Christian Virtue, the Mystery of Grace and Moral Excellence with Father Michael Sherwood. We hope to see you then. Thank you and God bless.
Thank you very much. God bless.